This week on the ground, I talked to Guri Hagen in Norway. Last week, I spoke to Vincent Scheffler in Sweden and got the perspective of what was happening in Sweden in terms of they have not imposed a strict lockdown for the pandemic and what are the effects and outcomes of that. Now I'm speaking to their neighbor to the west, Guri Hagen in Norway. We are going to have a good conversation. Guri works in the development sector. She works with refugees. She's Norwegian. She's a new mother, and so trying to get all those perspective on how the pandemic is affecting her and everyday citizens in Norway, and have an understanding of how they feel about the government supports that are in place, how Norwegians are reacting to the lockdown, what are the fears and hopes post-pandemic. So really looking forward to my conversation with Guri and getting her perspective on what's going on in Norway during the pandemic. I'm very pleased to be here with my friend Guri from Norway. Guri and I met in Pakistan, of all places, many years ago. And how long has it been now, Guri? It's been like 8 years, 10 years? 8 years, at least.
Yeah.
8 years we met in Karachi, and she was very crucial in my courting of her friend Megan, who is now my wife. Guri was involved in all of the courting and was there to see it happen in real time. One of the few people that was there to see it happen in real time. And then Guri went back to her home country of Norway and has been there. Have you been there for the whole 8 years? You haven't gone back anywhere, have you, or traveled anywhere?
No, I've been here.
Yeah, and you have 3 lovely daughters now, and you're living in Norway. So how are things there? Tell us a little bit about what's going on in Norway and yourself and what you're up to and what your family's up to.
Yeah. Normally I work with the settling refugees in Trondheim, my hometown. And 2 weeks before I was meant to go on leave to have a baby, the country was shut down. So I got 2 weeks of that working from home with all the children home. And then I went on leave. So things have changed like everywhere else with how you do things. You have to try to meet people online instead of in person, all of this. And then in my family, being suddenly isolated and then having a third child, it was sort of a surprise that we weren't going to meet anyone. No grandparents were my husband got to be at the birth, but not, the husbands are not allowed in before it's very, very active phase, and then for 4 hours afterwards, and then they have to go home. So it was all of these strange things, doing a lot of things alone, as a new mother or as a family. So we were quite happy now. Norway has started opening up. We've not had many deaths. We've not had, everything's been out of control. And now we're in the situation where the country's opening up. The kids are back in kindergarten. That happened late in April, after everything closing down in mid-March. And then this week, all the school children will be back the coming week. So that means that we really have to pay attention to things could change now with the numbers of infected increasing. So that's, yeah.
But it's very interesting to note that you in Norway, they imposed very strict lockdowns very early, and in that case you've been able to keep your infected down to about 8,000 people, and your deaths are to 200 people, which is amazingly low, considering your eastern neighbor Sweden, which we'll talk about as well, is now at 23,000 cases and almost 3,000 deaths. they have twice the population, but still, they have 3 times the cases and more than 10 times the deaths as you. And they obviously took a very relaxed approach to restrictions and lockdowns, and Norway took a very heavy approach. But it sounds like things are opening up, but I haven't heard that, even since things are happening up, there hasn't been any spikes in cases or anything. It seems like it's still very much under control in Norway.
Yeah, I think it was late March that quite a lot of people, or not a lot, but 265 or something, they were admitted to a hospital with the virus, and then now we're down to 30 or something like that. So that's really what we have to see now, if that increases or how that works.
Is so one of the Sweden's reasons for not imposing strict lockdown is they said that they have a very robust healthcare system, and to be honest, their healthcare system is still, even with all the cases and the deaths, it's still only at 80% capacity. Is it the same in Norway? Is the feeling that the healthcare system can cope with any, now that they're opening up again? Because you're quite early in the opening up versus some of the other countries. So is the feeling still that now the healthcare system can cope and is prepared?
Yeah, it seems that we needed some time to get everything in order, that we didn't have enough of the equipment that you need, not for testing, of course, which no one had, but also all the gear that you need. We didn't have enough, and that's been quite heavily criticized, how the government's been warned that this could happen, and we haven't
prepared,
done anything about it.
Yeah.
So we needed time to get everything in, and now my impression is that is much better, the situation.
Yeah, and that's another one of the things that Sweden officials say, right, is that the idea behind the lockdowns is to flatten the curve, and that the cases are still going to come. You just push them further down in time to allow the healthcare system to prepare, which is sort of the strategy that Norway went down, versus they said, no, we're ready now, so we're going to handle our cases as they come up now and not try to push them down. So they're saying that their numbers might be high now, but then everybody else will catch up. That's sort of their system. So it seems like, Norway recognizes that, in the sense that they wanted time to get the equipment and be prepared to handle all the cases.
And we also had in Norway, our prime minister said that we were going to slow flatten the curve. But then for some weeks she was talking about stopping the pandemic, or just repressing it completely. And that's not the approach that Sweden has had at all. But now we're back to a situation where the government is talking about just isolating infected cases and testing. And it seems also that in Sweden, I think the health authorities in Sweden and Norway is saying much of the same things, but the government in Norway took more extreme measures than the Swedish. It seems that they have, at least I don't think that the health authorities in Norway, they did not advise that we close the schools, but that was a political choice to do that. And it seems that in Sweden they've followed the health authorities' advice much more.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness to Sweden as well, I mean, it's not like they didn't impose any restrictions. They did travel bans and closing of the borders, and they did recommend, even though they kept retail and restaurants and hospitality all open, diminished capacities and social distance and all these things. And the other idea in Sweden, I think this is probably similar culture in Norway as well, is that they felt that people were very responsible and responsive, and it was a culture of of people taking care of each other anyway. So there wasn't any requirement for the government to be strict on these policies.
We have both Norway and Sweden. We have enormous trust in our government. And I think um, the situation in Sweden is not out of control at all. It's very controlled, and it's just bold.
Mhm. It is.
It's surprising and bold, their strategy. And in Norway, we've just, I think there was a bigger sense that at least no one should say that we didn't try our best, that we didn't try hard enough, that those lives that we have probably saved is the most important thing.
Absolutely, and Sweden's bold strategy comes at a cost, right? More than 50% of their deaths are the elderly, right? And so that is the cost. And they admit that, their strategy in terms of taking care of senior homes and elderly care has been very weak, and that results in, an over emphasis on the deaths being in the elderly population. So there's always a cost to these kinds of strategies. On the other hand, you have Belgium, which is a similar population to Sweden. Belgium's about 11 million, Sweden's 10.5, but they have twice the cases as Sweden and 3 times the number of deaths in Belgium. And they did and Belgium also imposed strict lockdown as well. So Sweden holds that up as an example of, there's no guarantees that even a strict lockdown is going to change the scenarios depending on your population density, your testing, etc. So those are, obviously it's very early now in terms of numbers, and as the weeks and months come by, we'll see if other countries, if the cases go up as they open up, and if Sweden's right in the sense that they, their numbers are high just because they took on the cases and the bold strategy ahead of time. What is maybe give a little bit more context for Norway. So Norway being a social democracy, just for everyone's information, it is a welfare state. A lot of the key requirements for public, like education, healthcare, affordable housing, all of these social supports are paid for by the government. It's public. Well, it's actually paid by taxpayers, but taken care of by the government. How do you? And I want to talk about this, about being a new mom. I mean, you already have 2 daughters, but you have a 2.5-week-old, which is amazing that you're able to do this interview with me. You must be extremely busy, but I found this really interesting. Right, there's a lot of talk in the West. I don't know if you know this about Norway's sovereign wealth fund, right? The $1 trillion that you're able to have in your sovereign wealth fund, and it's always attributed to your oil reserves, and that's a big deal, especially here in Alberta, because we set up a heritage fund, a while back, but we don't have anywhere near the money that Norway has managed to sock away. But I found it really, really interesting that when I was doing my research, that actually a lot of the money that's in this sovereign wealth fund, it does not come from oil. It comes from income tax from women.
Yeah.
I found that amazing because nobody talks about that. And
Yeah.
by the way, Norway has a conservative government. So, we can't hold it up as like some sort of liberal utopia. It has a conservative government. But the reason that they attribute this $1 trillion wealth fund, one of the reasons, I mean, there obviously is oil and gas money in there, but it's the fact that the social supports are so great: childcare, free education, free childcare, care for the elderly, healthcare, all of these things that usually become a burden on women are taken care of by the government, so women can work and pay income tax. So how do you feel about that? I mean, that must be, just as you said, I mean, you had to work from home for a couple of weeks, and do you find that those kinds of supports are really crucial in the ability for women to have children and to continue working?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And because you lose out in the labor market if you, as a woman, you have to take the burden of, or the joy and the burden of, everything that comes with having children. So we're still working on policies to make men and women take on those things like the leave, the parental leave after having a baby. We have, you choose whether you have with the 80% salary 46 weeks, or with 100% salary 46 weeks off or 56 weeks off with the 80% salary.
Wow.
And then a new thing now is that actually that has been divided into 3, those weeks. So one is for the mom, one is for the dad, and there's the last third you can divide however you want between you, so that the dad comes more into play earlier, and also employers start to stop associating women in a certain age with the sort of problem of, oh, they'll be out on leave, they'll come back, so that's more what is it, shared.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, the research shows that, maternity leave has such a detrimental impact on the salary for women. You never make that up in your career, that time that you have to leave to have children and take care of children, unless you're provided support, right? And that to me is just amazing, 80% and 100%. Because, the problem in Canada is, yes, we have a year's maternity leave for women, and you can share that with your husband. And now they've actually increased it to 18 months. But the problem is that the financial support isn't there. You're lucky if you get 40% of your salary via unemployment insurance, right? There's no top up from your employer or unless you work in the federal government, which I think people in the federal government get quite a good top up on their maternity leave. But anywhere else, you don't, right? So, the fact that they increased it from a year to 18 months doesn't really help unless you happen to have a spouse who makes a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
So it actually only helps the wealthy. It only helps the people in upper middle class and above, because now they can take off more time. But if you're dependent on a second income in your household, you can't take off that more time, because the fact is now that same amount of money you were allocated for the year has to stretch out over 18 months. So that's amazing to hear. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is that Quebec is the only province in Canada, I believe, that provides paid childcare to households, pays for childcare for households. And when they implemented that, and I think it was in the late 90s that they implemented that public childcare, and they immediately saw an increase in GDP from women being able to work, right? Because when you can't afford childcare, or childcare is, the costs are so high that it doesn't make sense for both spouses to work, that obviously has impact on your household income, or the ability for especially the mother to work, because there's a time, obviously, that a mother has to take off with when she has a child, right? There's that time that has to be taken off, even if you're, the spouse, the father takes some time off, there's still, obvious reasons why the mother has to take time off. So this ability for the government to provide subsidized childcare is just, it's amazing, and everywhere else, you keep hearing this talk, oh, we can't afford it. But if immediately you see a return on GDP and money from income taxes paid by women, like, it pays for itself. And I was amazed to hear this about Norway, because that's further proof for this.
Yeah. And another thing I recently learned, I just hadn't thought about it, how that actually works, but in Norway we have everyone gets paid, not the same, obviously, but if you work in a grocery shop, you get so much more than a person in the USA. This was the example in the USA. And if you're an engineer working in Norway, you make a lot less than anywhere where the sort of market decides on the level of salaries. That we have this system in Norway where the level of salaries are decided. I think they start with the industries that has to export, that does the sort of, they're on the forefront of the Norwegian economy, so that they have to sort of check what would be a reasonable how much can we raise salaries without putting ourselves out of the competition with the rest of the world. And then they decide maybe 2.5%, 3.5%, and then that's everyone else doing negotiating salary has to, they cannot go over that limit set. I don't know if that made complete sense.
Oh, it does. And there's a lot of that conversation happening here in the US and Canada, Guri, is because now, we've labeled these, retail workers as essential, right? Grocery stores and other places where we have to we can't survive if they don't work. All of a sudden they're essentials, even though, before the pandemic, there was so much controversy over raising a minimum wage, to a place where, at least people are earning above the poverty line, $15 an hour. Those debates continued, and, new governments were rolling back increases in minimum wage. And in the US, they're still fighting minimum wage requirements. They're fighting paid sick leave for employees and, so-called essential services now. And when I was researching Norway, I found that really interesting. So what they're saying is that instead of letting, the owners of the businesses decide on things like minimum wage and workers' rights and labor conditions, there's a federation, a sort of a labor federation that makes these decisions. And they negotiate amongst themselves in terms of exactly what you were saying, is like, what is the most competitive way to deal with this? And then, and that's such a smart way. I mean, that's why, they say Norway's an egalitarian social democracy, right? That's such a smart way to do it, because then we're all on the same page. If we're all involved in the conversation of like, what can we pay our workers and still remain competitive, then it's a level playing field. It's not me having to pay my employees more, so it makes it harder for me to be profitable while my competitor is paying his employees less, right? No, we all got together and we decided that here's what we can pay as a fair wage to all of our employee and staff, and all still remain competitive. It seems like such an intelligent way to approach it.
And then to get this system, you need that level of trust that we just have, probably for historical, social, economical reasons, but it's hard to you can't just put the system in place if you don't have that level of trust going with it. And
You're absolutely right. And trust is a huge problem in North America, right? Trust of our government just isn't there. One of the reasons why they say that, people are so reluctant to increase taxes or put in new taxes is they don't trust the government to spend it responsibly. Because in the past, whenever they've told us a tax was temporary, or a tax was going to be used for a certain purpose, that's not what the purpose it was used for, and the tax never went away. So we just don't have that trust. So, but in Norway, I found it really interesting. So here's another thing. So they're saying that up to 4% of the sovereign wealth fund that Norway has, the government can extract up to 4% a year for emergencies. So what I'm hearing is that they are tapping into that fund for the pandemic, because the reality is that personal spending in Norway is down 70%. And that's another thing, right? So that Sweden holds up as an example of why they're doing the right thing, is their personal spending is only down 30%, versus in the other Nordic and Scandinavian countries, it's down more like 70%. So obviously there's a real issue in terms of revenue. There's a real issue in terms of unemployment. There's 4 times faster unemployment in Norway than in Sweden. So these things are of concern. So the government has been tapping into this $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund. But I hear that the economists are pushing back. The economists are pushing back and saying, we don't need to tap into this. Let's just figure out a progressive way to increase taxes when people are getting back to work, and to recover this money, and that we shouldn't be tapping into this wealth fund, which again is a fascinating, amazing thing to me, that this wealth fund is supposed to be only for old age pension, to take care of your population as they age. What an amazing way to have that trust, right? This is how governments earn trust, right, Guri? Is because you feel like at every step of the way, the government's taking care of you. They're already thinking about how to take care of an aging population. and they're already pushing back. Let's not spend our savings, or let's not spend our fund that we've put aside to take care of our aging population. To me, that's where trust is earned. But
Yeah.
so what are you hearing back and forth in terms of economy and the economists versus the government? How's this conversation going?
All that I've heard is that it looked like we might be touching on the 4% if, with all the packages and the rescue initiatives, and that the rule, the very strict rule that we have always abide by, is that we do not go over 2% of the income of that fund. So going up to 4% is that would be very radical. And then obviously there's always the discussion, why can't we take more? Why can't we take some? We could have trains going up to the far north in Norway, which we don't have. We could use this for infrastructure. We could use this maybe for doing something for the climate. But it's we had a political party to the far right that was in government until 3-4 months ago. Now they're not. So now we have center to conservative parties. So we might have had more of that discussion if the far right was still in power. But it is a strange thing with this. I'm not. This is not my government, but I have not. I mean, I have complete trust in what the Prime Minister is doing. I abide by everything she says, and I really truly believe that she never thought she was going to be in this position of telling the whole of Norway to stay indoors, don't hug your mom, all of these things that we're doing. It is just, it's very strange to observe yourself just complying with everything. And just, we have this word in Norwegian, dugnad. It means it's basically when everyone comes together to do some job, and there's food and drinks and a party afterwards. You do a job together, and then so that's what we're having. It's a national dugnad. Stick to it.
I love that. I love that philosophy, right? Is that we're all gonna suffer the pain right now to reap the rewards later together, right?
Yeah. But I was thinking, I mean, with Sweden earlier, we're very, very, I think that we look to Sweden. We're extremely interested in what they're doing. We're always the little brother, so we might hope that they're doing it wrong and that we're doing it right, but we don't know, and we don't know. It will take a long time until we know, and no one would have gotten it completely right. It's going to be all these factors that we can look at for the next decade.
Absolutely,
So, yeah.
Go ahead, keep going.
No, we're just very careful to pass judgments because also we don't know. I saw this about 400 people in the Oslo area was tested for anti substances, or and around 2% had those, and around 10% in Sweden had those, and numbers from New York were 15%, and we wouldn't want to be in New York, where New York has been and is. But when are we going to get out of this? Are we just doing it slow and painfully, and everyone's out of a job at the end of it? And what happens when autumn comes and the next influenza season on top of this virus might sort of coming back in a more vicious form? What do we know? There's just all of these questions, especially now that we're opening up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why, as I'm doing these interviews, I'm careful not to pass judgment. I did an interview in Sweden with a friend of mine that lives there last week. So, he gave me a good perspective of what's happening on the ground there. And, you're right. I mean, time will tell. No one knows, who's doing what right. This virus is so unique that, it's hard to tell, even though we've had pandemics in the past and we've had viruses that we've dealt globally with in the past. This is a unique case. And also to our, the global reaction to this virus is much different than what's been done in the past. So, I guess we can all take a little comfort in the fact that we're all kind of dealing with the same situations around the world economically anyway. Some countries are better equipped to deal with it than others. But I mean, it is nice, 4%, even 4% of $1 trillion is a lot of money. You're talking about, what are you talking about? $50 billion or so. Where in Canada, because we don't have these kinds of reserves, we're already $200 billion in the hole with all of the financial supports being provided by citizens. Our federal government's doing a great job actually of taking care of citizens, but there is going to be a huge financial cost for Canada versus, I think much like a household budget that has a large savings for emergencies, Norway's in a good position that, they have these savings to fall back on in the worst case scenario, which I think few other countries are in that position.
Yeah. I think this is, I wrote something to you about being in a bubble. And I think also this, living in Norway, Scandinavia is also one of the bubbles. It's
well, we all look at Scandinavian countries as, the utopias that of happiness and security, as is shown in survey after survey, right? That, the countries that surround Norway are always very high up in the happiness and health and safety of citizens indexes. And there's a reason for that, because I think these countries do a lot to earn that trust of the citizens. And seems like all the policies are designed around taking care of the people, which is what they should be. But also too, I mean, there is also, reasons for that as well. As you mentioned, the Scandinavian countries are very homogenous, right? You have 80, 90, more, 95, 97% of the population is all white or Caucasian and are all indigenous to those countries. And you have very little immigration and very little multiculturalism. So historically, that plays a lot into the ability of countries to put in the kind of social supports that you have, right? Because, and this is being very generic and broad of a very complex issue, but the feeling is that, it's much easier to agree to pay higher taxes because you're taking care of people that are like you and of you, right? Versus feeling like they're outsiders or not of similar backgrounds, right? And that plays a lot of part into a lot of these things. I mean, you see right now in the U.S., Blacks and Latinos and other people of color are at least twice as likely, sometimes 4 times as likely to get the coronavirus and to die from it because of socioeconomic conditions, because of their poor health system, right? And you don't see very much help for them or even recognition of this, right? As because, a large part of it is that, the people that are in power don't look very differently from the people who are actually suffering. So, I mean, that's a big rabbit hole we can jump into another time of the racial causes of these kinds of equalities and inequities. But I do want to come because you do work at.
We certainly have our problems in Norway.
What are those problems? Tell me a little bit about that. I mean, you work in the social services, social development sector. So what are some of the problems you work with specifically with refugees? So what are the cases, problems, issues right now in that sector?
Well, we right now we're seeing this has more to do with the European policies that were shutting everyone out, and the refugees cannot reach Norway's borders, so they can't apply for asylum. So we're not getting many. People aren't coming to the country, and the refugees that we were getting through the UN system there, that has stopped because of the pandemic. But I was thinking more in the debate that you see in Norway. You certainly see the lack of trust with people coming in, and not coming in with the respect that we have for the welfare system. Are people just gonna take advantage of it? Are people gonna understand? That suspicion is there, and we have always, I mean, as long as I've lived, the greatest terrorist threat in Norway has always been from right extremist sort of neo-Nazi environments. But yeah.
Yeah, we have the same instances here as well, right? The idea that, the terrorism threat is from the outside has been disproven over and over, right? The number of deaths and mass killings, etc., in the U.S. is always homegrown. It's always, more often than not, a white male, but again, the ones that are held up are the few instances where it might be someone who's an immigrant or a foreigner, or a refugee that was the cause of it. But the statistics don't back that up at all. But it's easy to, as we talked about, it's easy to breed suspicion and fear of the other, right? It's easy to breed suspicion and fear, and even that, it's amazing to me. It's actually not amazing. It's very understandable in a country like Norway, where what's the population would be of refugees or immigrants and things? It must be like less than 5%.
I thought maybe around 13.
Really, that high?
I think so.
Okay. So, I mean, it's growing, obviously. So that is also going to, as you said, cause for concern for people who have, lived multi-generations in Norway, and seeing outsiders come in and have those concerns that, that how much can the welfare system hold? How much can the welfare system take care of? Because the reality is, newcomers, immigrants, refugees can be taxing on a welfare system.
And the same logic is there if we have a good system that gets these people what they need to have a job and keep it in Norway, then we don't lose out. Then we gain from.
And that's the thing we learned with our refugee settlement in Canada, is that we took on too many too fast. My wife worked within that system for a little while, and and she would say the same thing, is that it's all great and good that we allowed them to come in and we're taking care of them and providing and doing our best to provide for them, but it would have been better to have a slower intake and put in the supports, right? Because so many refugees and newcomers are just struggling to make a life here. I mean, obviously, I'm sure that they recognize that the safety is here, and at least that they can start rebuilding their lives. But the supports just aren't there. The public supports just aren't there. The people aren't there to take care of them. The finances aren't there. So a lot of them really, really struggle for a long time.
Yeah, you need to do both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you need to look at the humanitarian aspect, but you also need to be prudent in, once you have all of these new people in your country, you have how you're going to take care of them and not make trade one problem for another, right? Where now they feel safe, but now they can't take care of themselves and their families and all the issues surrounding that. What else do we want to talk about? What about so overall, it sounds like Norwegians are very happy with what the government's doing in terms of taking care of people during the pandemic. What is the predictions for what's going to happen as the country opens up? What are the fears? What are the hopes of change that might be on everyone's mind?
There's been a lot of talk about the schools reopening, and at first it was the concern about the children that really needs to come to school for whatever reason, who struggles at home, or have parents who can't really help them with their work, or they need some sort of special training, and all the kids that because what you see is that the child struggle. I haven't. There's some words that I haven't tried to find in English before. The child security services.
Mm-hmm.
They're not getting as many reports that they used to from schools, obviously, and kindergartens. So there was this feeling that there's a lot of children that we are not taking good care of now because we don't know what's happening to them in this situation at home. So that was the debate, that we need to get them out. and as the kindergartens and the schools are now reopening, there's a lot of fear that the infection rates will go up, and there's a lot of debate: is kids bearers of disease and infection, or are they not? They tend not to get as sick, but what does that mean? Can they still spread it? And there's back and forth. And it was said that 40% were going to hold their kids back from school. At first to fourth grades opened up, but at least in my hometown, 95% of the kids showed up. So that might be more of a media hype than actual fear in parents.
That's interesting. Do you find, so, there is that concern here as well, that, children who may not have had the best situations at home are now subjected to that, full time. They, don't get a reprieve from that, or an ability to escape it. And also to domestic violence is a huge concern as well. Are there any instances of reporting in terms of increases in domestic violence in Norway?
I haven't seen whether it's actually been documented, but it's been assumed. We had a mother of 4 was found dead in Trondheim, and her husband was arrested for it, and we don't know what actually happened, but you could fear that it was a case of that. But I haven't seen it I think it's very likely that in general domestic violence has increased, and parents are stressed out and might be losing their jobs. They don't know what's going on. It's a very difficult situation to be a good carer in if you don't know how to cope with it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the mental health issues, I think, that are going to come out once people feel a little bit better maybe about their financial situations. I think the mental health issues are going to be one of the large causes of this pandemic that we also aren't prepared for, in terms of how people are going to be able to cope with, not even just currently in the pandemic, people are dealing with all kinds of mental health issues, but afterwards as well.
And maybe then you'll see more of maybe then the anger will come for what this did to me, that we're not seeing now in Norway so much. Obviously there are some people saying, is this really necessary? But I think, these things will show in the months or years to come.
Are there protests? I don't know if you've seen the news, like in the US, people are protesting because they want things to open up so they can get a haircut and go out to eat. Is there any of that sort of public demonstration of, unrest at all in Norway?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. It seems like people People right now are just trusting in the government to do what's right.
Yeah. And the sort of freedom, this idea of freedom, I should be free to do whatever I want at all costs, isn't such a, um, it's not, yeah. No, we're more, right now more about the dugnad.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, right? Like psychologically, right? That people who trust their government and feel like their government takes care of them in situations like this, they're not as dependent on individualism, right? Because hey, we got this far, all coming together and taking care of each other. Let's just continue to do that, right? And it's a whole different mentality than we have in North America, where individualism and freedom and this idea of like I should be able to do whatever I want whenever I want, and the government shouldn't interfere in my business. But I think that is a two-way street, right? It's because we also don't have a lot of trust in our government to take care of us, because they haven't done a great job so far.
And also it's uh, for instance in India, and where all of those people are just getting on buses and trains and trying to come home to the villages that they're from, because they've now lost their jobs and they're facing starvation, because you can't fix this, you can't, in the same way as Norway or many other countries, you can't provide for the people in the same way, and people know that a lot of places, that they're actually, the consequences, they're going to have to face this alone. So then that's the whole different situation.
Yeah, I did speak to somebody in India as well. He gave me an idea of, so, India has many challenges that, a country like Norway doesn't. One is, the second biggest population in the world. So their issue with population density is a huge problem. They have something like 100 million migrant workers, people, like you said, who come from villages to work in urban centers, and then, have to go back and are now stuck. Also, poverty is a much bigger concern in a place like India. Literacy is a big concern as well, right? So they have their own challenges, but India also has kept their numbers surprisingly low, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that, as well as when I talk to the gentlemen in India as well, right? Is their ability to lock down quickly, their preparedness, because in a place like India, something like this happens every year. We all in the West live in a utopia where we only have to deal with these kinds of situations maybe once a decade. They deal with this in a yearly. If it isn't a epidemic of some kind, it's a natural catastrophe, right? So the people are very resilient and able to react much more quickly than maybe we can in the West. They have a very young population, right? So the resistance is much higher. But I mean, there's still the issue with that young population is that in India, they live in multi-generational households, so they can transmit it to the elderly, right? So much different challenges in India. But I mean, even still, in South Asia, in the global South, they've kept their numbers surprisingly low as compared to in the West.
I hope that, I mean, I was expecting more news to come also from African countries, and we haven't sort of seen what I thought we would see or feared that we would see from different countries that don't have a good health system that everyone can get access to and all of this. So I'm very, I'm not eager, I'm not, but interested, or I don't know what to expect, but what will happen when this, it seems that it hasn't hit everywhere yet. We don't know how it's going to pan out everywhere yet.
Yeah, I mean, some of the theories around both Africa and Asia is low testing, obviously, is one of the issues, is that they're unable to test in the frequency that we are out here in the West. So the numbers the numbers we're seeing aren't maybe as real as they might be later on. And also underreporting, right? Because when you have, an impoverished country, people don't tend to die in hospitals, right? They'll die at homes, and it goes unreported. They say it could be up to 5 times the actual amount of deaths, right, because of the underreporting. So I think we'll see those numbers come forth. But I also think that there's also a real argument for the fact that, again, Africa much better prepared, right? They've had to deal with Zika virus and Ebola and all of these different things, and natural disasters constantly, right? So, again, much more resilient populations. And I think that plays a large factor in it. And I think that, they have, maybe it's not a formal structure of support, and that comes into play whenever a disaster or an epidemic happens nationwide, but they have informal, I think, ways of dealing with it that just come into effect. I do think that the numbers will be a lot higher than we're seeing reported out of those areas, but I also have a feeling that they're not going to be as high as people think, just because they haven't been able to test as frequently as we've tested out here in the West. But I think it will be really interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking because I heard something on the radio today, how in Norway we have now matured a whole generation of youngsters on facing hardship, some sort of hardship that it's been so long since this country has faced that we kind of thought that would never happen, not here, or not all the way. Like we think that things won't reach us all the way up in our little corner. That's one thing, and I remember saying to my mom, like, I don't know if my husband gets to come to the birth, and she just said, yeah, times are hard. And we've just never had to accept that times are hard. Like, this is, the rules have changed. This is what we have to do now. and we just had to sit in our house. So it's not really, but it's just this taste of not being in control, and this experience of having to mobilize together to do this big change in the way we live. Like it's just an interesting thought to see what we could do with that, because this is just an experience that we've not had since my grandfather's generation of the Second World War here.
That's a really amazing, thought-provoking observation on your part and your mother's part. I think we're learning that even in this globalized world, that we've all been acting too independently, right? Just as Norway felt like, these problems don't affect us, in the countries in the US and UK, etc. We also have this feeling that, our actions don't affect other people, right? And I think that if anything from this pandemic, we realize that, the whole world, our actions and our policies, our foreign policies, our domestic policies have consequences around the world. I think that we need to, if anything, focus on that and have a better understanding that, we can't continue to ignore what's happening in other countries just because it's not having any effect on us in our little cushioned part of the world, right? Because that's what we tend to do, is we turn a blind eye to what's happening in the East, or in Asian countries, or in Africa, because it doesn't really affect us. But now we realize that it does, and that we should pay more attention to these things, and we should pay more attention to how our consumerism and our foreign policy can be the cause of these things as well.
And just working with refugees, I've heard a lot of stories about when everything just changed and they realized that they had to get out, and just I've never had any moment where everything just changed, like the rules of the game, everything just changed. Like what I thought I would be doing tomorrow or next week, or now I don't know. And just that it's not as dramatic as having to flee and leave your life behind, but it's just gives a taste so that it's just a little bit easier to or just now I can imagine in a better way than I could what that must be like, and just that understanding, it's quite valuable. Yeah, but
Yeah,
also this can happen to anyone, that everything just changes.
yeah, if anything comes out of this, maybe we have a little bit more compassion and understanding for the plight of the refugee, right? Imagine, it's only been a few weeks from us of like in somewhat income insecurity, a little bit of food insecurity, a little bit of mental stress. Imagine living years and years in a country where, you don't know where your food's going to come from the next day. You don't know if you're going to be bombed to death the next day. You don't know if you're going to have a home the next day. You don't know where you're going to sleep. And we criticize refugees for wanting to leave those situations and come into our countries. And we can't even, after a few weeks, we're worried about our haircuts and, being able to go out to eat. That's a kind of insulation that we in the West have enjoyed. And if anything, I hope, Guri, that this is what we all can leave with. And I love that idea that, you've hardened a generation. Harden's, I think, too strong of a word, because I think you have to go through, you have to go through a difficulty for a lot longer and a lot more intense to really change people, right? But at least now they have a little bit of an insight. We all have a little bit of insight to what could happen, how insecure all of these safeties and provisions that we have are, and how dependent they are in the rest of the world as well, right? I mean, now food security is a huge issue around the world, because now we're realizing that all these countries we didn't care about before, when they got hit by floods and typhoons, and because we still kept getting our coffee beans and we kept getting our groceries, now how it can really affect us, because if they can't operate and they can't get their workers out and they can't take care of their crops and they can't take care of their people, that really affects our ability to have the lives and lifestyles we enjoy. And I think this is the first time in a long time that people are really starting to understand what globalization truly means, right? And how we are all intertwined. Whereas before we were just very selective of what we wanted globalization. We wanted the benefits of our, our ability to consume products from all around the world, and our cheap cell phones and cheap clothing, but we didn't want to hear about all of the side effects of that on the people that live in those countries and work in those countries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything you wanna close off with, Guri? It's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for sharing those insights with me. And it's exactly what I wanted to get from you, is that perspective of a Norwegian, this perspective of a working mother, the perspective of someone who works in the development sector. Is there anything else you want to leave off on in terms of what your other hopes, expectations, fears might be?
No, I think that was a nice way of it's a nice last note that we had there.
Thanks so much, Guri, for spending the time, and I'm so happy that we were able to reconnect, and so happy that you were able to take the time away from your brand new little one to spend some time with me.
I can hear that Daddy has now been training a bit more on the bottle, and it seems to it's quiet again. So this is good for us too.
That's amazing. That's amazing, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Yeah, and good to see you and the whole family.
Good to see you as well.